Welcome back to Bumblebee for a video about the top 10 spine-chilling punishments from ancient India. Punishment number 10 is the elephant. Those same guys that you watch paint at the zoo or roll around in the mud are the same hardcore MFs that used to be weapons of war in South and Southeast Asia. While elephants were no strangers to the battlefields, they were a common capital punishment method as well, called the gungareo. As they were smart and easily trainable, they could be used to crush, dismember, or overall torment captives in very public death sentences. The earliest record of death via elephant dates back to the classical period. However, the practice was already well established by that time and continued well into the 19th century. The most common way that the execution by elephant was carried out was the obvious: crush its victim to death with brute force. But elephants were even sometimes used in a kind of trial by ordeal, where the condemned prisoner is released if he manages to fend off the elephant for long enough. The Mughal Emperor Akbar the Great is said to have used this technique to chastise rebels, and then in the end, the prisoners, presumably much chastened, were given their lives. So this obviously tells you that aside from enemy soldiers, civilians who commit certain crimes could also be punished in this brutal way. These crimes included theft, tax evasion, heresy, and rebellion. During the expedition to central India in 1868, Louis Rousselet, a French writer, photographer, and traveler, described a death sentence of a criminal by elephant. The sketch was made of the event showing the condemned being forced and placing his head on a pedestal and then being held there, while the elephant foot crushed his head. Yeah. So, punishment number 9 is branding, a global classic. Who in the ancient world wasn't branded B-words for doing stuff they didn't want them to do? Now, in Euro nations, it was usually women or servant workers getting marked up, but in India, it was also a punishment for things other than being caught with your pants down, literally. See, how they liked to do it was the culprit was branded with a hot iron, smack dab in the center of their forehead with the words describing the offense. If you stole eggs, they will brand "stole eggs" on your face, which is equally hilarious and embarrassing. So I guess the shame part would really actually work there, especially because this branding punishment always came with a reduction of social class too. This method was commonly used in classical societies. In India, it was practiced during the Mughal rule, and it since has been completely abolished. Punishment number 8 is pillory. This device was shared between a few nations. The Europeans loved this crap and used it on women constantly. As you may know from the Bumblebee videos, top 10 spine-chilling ways women were punished in medieval times, part 1 and 2. If you haven't seen those, maybe go check them out on our channel and subscribe to the Hive while you're at it so you don't miss out on anything else. In pillory, the offender was compelled to stand in a public place with his head and hands locked in the iron frame so that he couldn't move. Uncomfortably hunched over, the victim would then have his ears nailed to the pillory through the top cartilage, so his head is forced up on an angle, adding to the uncomfortable position of the spine. It would essentially be like this. Then finally, the victim would be whipped, branded, or stoned. However, if the victim was super hella dangerous, I don't know, maybe he was like a top soldier, turned evil, but had really good battle skills, and they had to be concerned about that, they'd use the pillory just to restrain him while they physically nailed the guy's actual body to a wall, then stoned them. This was practiced till the 19th century. Punishment number 7 is lost limbs. In other words, it means damaging a person severely, especially by removing a part of the body. It's another classic amongst the medieval societies, and like others who like to cut limbs off as punishment, it was usually the nose, ears, hand, or feet in India. Whatever the crime was determined the limb lost. During that period, one or both of the hands of a person were chopped off if the offender committed theft. If he indulged in intercourse offenses, such as violating someone, his privates were cut off. That one still happens nowadays, just usually once the prisoner is already in jail. Not done by the government. Anyways, back to it. If he told a lie or criticized God, his tongue would be cut off, and if he was deceitful or untrustworthy, his ears were cut off. Punishment number 6 is brain ablaze. So, in ancient India, it turns out another fun punishment was to have certain parts, but only parts, of your body set on fire. This punishment came in alongside the upheavals of ancient Indian political history, wherein kings and dynasties faced endless threats and challenges from rivals. Enough so that, like all kingdoms, violence against the king became a serious political problem that had to be dealt with ruthlessly and effectively through preemptive action, punishment, and retaliation. The punishment for one who reviles, spreads evil news about the king, or reveals council secrets is punished with tearing out the tongue, as aforementioned. More severe crimes against the king and kingdom, however, invite more severe punishments. Death by setting fire to the hands and head is a punishment for one who covets the kingdom, forces entry into the king's harem, attacks the king's palace, aids his enemies, incites forced people or enemies, or causes a rebellion in a fortified city, countryside, or army. The man is restrained, his head and hands doused in sulfur or another flammable, and lit ablaze. Punishment number 5 is blown asunder. This was the advent of British colonialists who tormented India in the 18th and 19th centuries. Blowing from a G word I can't say on YouTube involved the condemned being tied in front of a cannon so that the small of their back was forced against the muzzle. Their arms and legs would be tied behind them, the rope pulled taut enough that it curves their limbs back behind them uncomfortably. The cannon would then be fired, pretty much obliterating the prisoner's abdominal portion and blowing them in half. Bonus points for all the guts raining down on everyone. One contemporary observer reported that a head was blown almost 50 feet in the air once, and limbs sometimes landed 100 yards away, and the rest of the body essentially just vaporized. Punishment number 4 is torn apart. Another colonial classic. This style of death sentence is found everywhere from Rome to medieval Britain to Persia. For those unfamiliar with this punishment, you'd have your 4 limbs tied either between 2 horses, one holding both arm ropes and holding both leg ropes, or it'd be 1 horse for each of your limbs. At the count of 3, all horseback riders would take off in opposite directions and rip the person in the center apart. In ancient India, however, instead of using horses, they used oxen. For example, a law was in place that women caught killing their husbands or family members, killing others by poison, or committing arson are to be torn apart by oxen. Punishment number 3 is cooked alive. The sensation of being boiled alive was an absolutely horrific one, yet it was a punishment for things as meager as theft or lying. A large cauldron was filled with water, oil, tar, fat, or molten lead and left to boil. Putting a victim in the cauldron before the boiling was done was the worst way to exert this punishment, as it meant they would probably remain conscious, and then he'd notice his eyes burning, clothes fusing with his body, and skin blistering. The limbs and extremities were the first things to burn after that. After the person's outer layers began to cook, their organs began to cook as well, and their bodily fluids rose in temperature, so they were also boiling inside. All who went through this medieval death could only pray for a fast and merciful one, but boiling to death was unfortunately a very slow process. A quick death would only come, as said, if the liquid was already boiling when the victim is dunked in. If it wasn't and they wanted to speed up their own deaths, the victim could always duck their head underneath the liquid and just boil their own brain that way. But otherwise, it was long and horrific until the very end. While this should have been reserved for only the worst offenders, it soon became a go-to death sentence for foragers of all people. In India, it was said in the Garuda Puranam that the people who didn't offer food to orphans and contaminated food are boiled in oil after their death. In 1606, Guru Arjan of the Sikhs was boiled alive as a form of torment and subsequently died on the orders of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Punishment number 2 is exposure. While this was less common in ancient India, it was part of other punishments such as pillory, whipping posts, or stocks, or it was used as a method of gaining confession. Victims could be exposed to the elements by restraining them somewhere outside, whether on the ground, which was more susceptible to bugs, pests, animals, and grime, or somewhere suspended, like a cage, off a wall. That one was popular in Europe. In summer, the guards could just pour hot water over the victim's head repetitively, which eventually increased body temperatures to the extent that heat stroke would take effect, causing a victim to die slowly and painfully. Sometimes the body was even left to decay publicly to dissuade any further crimes. During cold days and nights, the chill, as well as the lack of protection from the wind, could easily sap a victim's body heat. Alternatively, the victim could be buried up to his neck, letting any animals, insects, or other people kill him slowly the way they want to. Due to its cost efficiency and cruelty, the exposure torment strategy was widespread in medieval Europe and many other places. In many cases, the victim was sentenced to a short period of exposure depending on the crime. However, death was frequent since they were completely defenseless, even if it wasn't intended to be more than a 2-day punishment. You never know. Punishment number 1 is immurement. However, it is more identifiable to the common person if I just call it being buried alive. Placing someone into a confined space and then sealing it up so they're forced to wait for their own death, whether it comes from dehydration, starvation, or even asphyxiation. Immurement also had been performed for aesthetic reasons in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, and examples can be found in plenty of written sources. The year is 1660 and the place is India. On the 6th of May, Shah Shuja, the second son of the Mughal emperor, boarded a ship and sailed from Dhaka to Arakan to find asylum from his brother who was now his father's successor and wanted to kill him. Shah's plan was to stay in Arakan for a short period before sailing over to Mecca, then Persia. But he landed there just as the monsoon season hit, and it trapped the prince in Arakan for many months. And then for life. See, while stuck there, the king asked Shah if his eldest daughter would marry his son. For some reason, this really grilled Shah's onions, and he tried to overthrow the Arakan king in a coup, which then was found out. Although Shah managed to escape into the jungle, he was subsequently caught and put to death. The prince's family, however, were thrown into prison after their capture, although they were set free later. Moreover, the king married Shah's eldest daughter himself. He didn't even give her to his son, really just spit on dad's grave like that. It seems like the surviving family members of Shah, including that eldest daughter, plotted to seize power again and overthrow the king, having clearly learned nothing. Like the last time the conspiracy was leaked, and this time the king meant business. If his family was going to keep being a problem, he was just going to exterminate the entire thing. According to the 17th century French physician and traveler Francois Bernier, the men were decapitated with axes, whilst the women were closed, confined in their apartments, left to die of hunger. All the windows and doors had been sealed. Even Shah's eldest daughter, now the king's wife, was not spared. Thank you once again for tuning into Bumblebee. I hope you enjoyed today's video. I urge you to take some time to drop a like, subscribe, and maybe comment down below, and I'll see you next time.